Cool. Right, so I kind of outlined this basic structure of what I thought we could run through. Tell me if you're missing something, keen to understand more about something else. But essentially what I thought kind of the overall kind of objective of these sessions would be is to give you basically a kind of Scrum 101 coaching and informational tutorial, if you like. Seeing as that's kind of seems to be primarily what you're focusing on. If you're focusing on like managing the backlog, looking at Jira, hosting Scrum ceremonies, things like this. So I'll go through them. I've split them up into 4 sections, and we might get through one in each hour, or we might get through a couple. We can just kind of see how we go and kind of pick it up from where we leave off. So the first one is basically like an introduction to Scrum. What is it? Where does it come from? What's its relationship to other principles which you might have heard of, like Kanban, Agile, and all of these things? What are some good resources that probably help you learn about the fundamentals of Scrum? What is essentially a Scrum team? How is it structured, and what are like the roles within it and the responsibilities of those various different people? What are some alternatives to Scrum? Because not everyone will use Scrum. There are some variations that are similar to it, but ultimately different, with slightly different workflows. And what is the current state of Scrum in Salt at the moment, just so you kind of have the context of how this fits in with how other teams are operating. Once we've done that, we can go into requirement breakdown, also requirement development, really, which is all about how do you describe what needs to be built within a team, which is kind of the foundation of kind of some of these other areas, which I thought would be good to touch on first. So this would be broken up into the breakdown structure. So how do we talk about different pieces of work which need to be delivered essentially by a software development team? How do we estimate the time that it will take to do these various things so we can plan accordingly? And I'll talk about story points or Fibonacci story points specifically there, and some alternatives to them as well, like t-shirt sizes. And then importantly speak about like the upstream workflow of how these requirements are actually developed over time to get them to a state where they're ready to be actually developed by some software engineers. So that's part 2. Part 3 is all about sprints and how we structure our work over time. So how do we run sprints? What are Scrum ceremonies? What should be essentially accomplished in each one? And we'll touch on like some of the key Scrum ceremonies like sprint reviews, sprint planning sessions, refinement sessions, daily stand-ups, and retrospectives, and talk about various ways that those can be structured within a sprint. And then finally, we can talk about, once you've kind of understand these basic principles in a theoretical level, actually dive into Jira and start to understand how we can apply a breakdown structure within Jira, how we look at backlogs in terms of how ultimately they should be structured, in terms of how things should be prioritized within them, and how the actual upstream workflow can be tracked within a backlog itself. And then finally touch on like team analytics. So how can we look at team performance over time using Jira with charts and graphs such as burn down charts and velocity reports. And essentially, I think once we've gone through all of those, you should have a pretty good idea of how Scrum works and how you can actually start to implement it. Does that sound good? Am I missing anything? Would you want to learn about anything more? Anything you didn't understand?
I think for the time being, and especially that these are like fundamentals, obviously I'll know if there's anything that's quite missing as we go through them, because there's a lot of different things that I'm not quite acquainted with, but so far so good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and let's keep it like conversational, and I'll just like talk and just interrupt me to say, Ed, that makes no sense, or I don't understand it, or whatever. Like, how I am, no stupid questions. I'm an open book. Cool, man. So should we kick off with the intro to Scrum section?
Perfect.
I'm afraid I don't really have any like slides or anything like this, so I'll just sort of like talk you through, and maybe I'll like.
I didn't expect it. I didn't.
No. And I'll kind of run you, just kind of talk, and we can have a conversation, and maybe I'll like draw some diagrams in PowerPoints or use some examples in like Jira and stuff like this. I might use some Confluence resources as well, because I've already written up a lot of this stuff in Confluence. But okay, cool. So background on Scrum. So you may have heard of something called Agile, right? And Agile is a philosophy about how to build software. And very importantly, it's a philosophy and not a methodology. So it's fairly open to interpretation. And Agile was developed, and I'm going to butcher the dates on this, but give you a rough idea of how you can think about it in time. It was developed around about in like the 70s or something like this, and was a direct response to how teams used to build things, generally software and also physical hardware goods and civil engineering projects and things like this. And the way that people used to do it was something called the waterfall approach to project management, where you basically outline the kind of dream of what you want to build. Say, oh, I want to build this big beautiful bridge, and it needs to have all of these features and all of this stuff, and this is like the end goal. And we're going to map out all of the different pieces of work sequentially that we need to do in order to get to this final goal. And the development work to build whatever this thing is could take like 5 years or something like that. And that is the appropriate way to do it for like a big engineering project. But ultimately, because software is so flexible, and you can ultimately build something and then improve it and like ship this new thing, which you've added stuff to, like the next week or the next day or something like this. It's much more flexible than like physical hardware goods or civil engineering or anything like this. People realize that applying the waterfall method to software doesn't really make a lot of sense, and is quite high risk actually, because ultimately what you're doing is you're saying long term we want to build this thing, this piece of software, and we're going to do all of this hard work to build the perfect thing, and then when it's done at the end in like multiple years time, we can ship it, and hopefully it does what the user actually needs it to do, and they actually like it, and it's built, and we've built basically what they need. But ultimately, because you haven't given it to a user to test it at all in the whole time that you've been building this thing, you may be building totally the wrong thing, and you may have to redo all of this work, and a lot of it could be wasted time and effort. So ultimately, Agile was a response to that traditional waterfall methodology, specifically in the context of software development, where they said, look, let's not wait until we have the perfect thing at the end. Let's build the smallest piece of value that we can offer to our user, give it to them, right, is the earliest we can, see how they interact with it, see if it solves their problems a little bit, and ultimately it won't be the fully fledged article, but they'll tell us what's missing or what's most important for us to build for them next. And then once we've done that and got that feedback, we can then focus on building what we know that they want next, right? And then we give it to them again and say, hey, like, you improved it, what should we do like for the next certain number of weeks, or what should we focus on next? And then basically you're incrementally offering like a slowly improving product to a user, rather than the final article all at the end, which means that once you get to the end, that what you've been building all over this time is actually useful work and is improving the lives of your user. So that's kind of the whole philosophy of Agile, and there are certain kind of principles that go along with it. You can read, like, I think it's called like the 7 principles of Agile, but it's fairly high level. So that's Agile, and how it relates to Scrum is people were kind of trying to implement this Agile way of working, but ultimately, because it's a philosophy and not a methodology, it's very open to interpretation. So 3 people came along, I think they're American, and they looked at Agile and said, okay, how about we take this broad philosophy and turn it into an actual methodology, which takes these agile principles and makes them very, very clear and actionable, and makes a kind of workflow which is very kind of prescriptive. And that's ultimately what Scrum, what created Scrum, is them taking this philosophy of agile and making it into a methodology. So that's what Scrum is, and it should be basically a guide for how software developments implement the agile way of working. Makes sense so far?
So far, so good.
Awesome. So that's kind of background. Resources, I would say, like, the key thing is read the Scrum guide. You can download it as a PDF. I can actually send it to you over Slack because I've downloaded it. And the Scrum guide is essentially this sort of like, it's ultimately like the Bible of Scrum, right? It's what these three folks wrote back in wherever in the 90s, and it talks about the overall principles of Scrum and how it should be done. It's only like 9 pages or something, so it's fairly easy to absorb. So that's the key thing I'd say on resources, but there are loads of other things as well, like on YouTube and stuff like this. Hopefully this is also a good resource. Right, so Scrum team roles and responsibilities. So you can look at it two ways. There's what's actually described in the Scrum guide and what actually happens in practice. How it's described in the Scrum guide is there are 3 roles within a Scrum team. There is the developers, who obviously their responsibility is to actually build the product. There is a product owner, which is essentially responsible for figuring out what to build. That's kind of the high level description, but how that looks in practice is they're responsible for writing user stories, which I'll talk about more in requirement breakdown, essentially describing features, figuring out what the features are through user research, putting them into a backlog and prioritizing the backlog so that the developers know like what to pick up in the next sprint. So that's one role, product owner, and the other role is the Scrum Master. And the Scrum Master is a bit of a tricky role to understand, but essentially what they are is like a mentor to the team on how to best implement Scrum within their way of working. So, for example, they will coach the team on how to do a lot of this stuff, how to break down requirements, how to estimate complexity of work, how to run these ceremonies in the most effective way, these like team-wide meetings. So they're like a sort of in the team, sort of outside the team, mentoring kind of work on how to best implement the Scrum process. And they can be doing this across multiple teams. An important thing to understand, and this is where we kind of are looking at how it's actually done in real life, is you will have heard of a product manager and a product owner, right? And a lot of people confuse the two, but ultimately, just like a Scrum Master, the product owner is a role specifically within a Scrum team. It's a set of responsibilities ultimately. It's not a job role within a company, right? So you can be the head of HR, right, and be taking on temporarily a product owner role. Doesn't mean that your job changes from the head of HR, right, but you're temporarily taking on that responsibility, right? And a product manager, the product manager role is a broader role, which is essentially being responsible for the success of a product overall within a business, irrespective of whether you're using Scrum or not. So you can be using the waterfall methodology, right, and still be a product manager, right? But you can't be a product owner if you're using the waterfall methodology because it's a Scrum specific term, right? So ultimately, that's why all big tech companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, Netflix, all of these, they don't have a job that you can apply to called a product owner. They're all product manager roles, and maybe some of the teams use Scrum, maybe some of them don't. And within that Scrum team, yeah, you would be taking on a product owner role in some of your job, but you also be doing things aside from backlog grooming. You're overall responsible for the success of the product. So you'll be, writing, if you're at Amazon, PRFAQ documents. You'll be setting out the hiring strategy for the team. You'll be working on growth and distribution and all of these things, which are broader than the actual product owner description in Scrum. You'll be doing that as well, but you have this broader role of a product manager. So that's how you can think about it. Some companies do call their PMs product owners. And as far as I know, they're doing this purely because they like the name more, and they want to inspire ownership within the team. That's literally why they call them product owners, not product managers, because they like the thinking of ownership rather than management. But ultimately, it's a bit off in terms of if you really want to sort of stick to what the terminology really means. So yeah, that's kind of the roles and responsibilities in Scrum. And then ultimately within software development teams, realistically, you'll have other roles. So for example, you'll have designers, you have quality assurance engineers, you have architects, and ultimately, product designers, they have a lot of different terminology for what to call them, but the kind of three main ones are UX designers, UI designers, and product designers. It's really a kind of semantics in terms of which one you call them, but people are generally moving to the description of product designers, which I really like actually, because I like designers on my team personally to feel true ownership for the features that they're designing. Right, I've worked with some designers previously who focus purely on like designing nice interfaces, or although that's valuable, kind of you can't really design the best interface if you don't know kind of what you're trying to achieve at a kind of product functionality level. So product designers in my team right now, they focus all the way from like user research, understanding customer needs, understanding how the product should ultimately work in terms of the mechanics of it, and actually designing the interfaces. So they own that kind of whole stream, which I think works well. Quality assurance engineers, they are essentially responsible for testing that product, that the product works, how it's intended to work, and they'll write things like test cases. So when I do this, I expect this to happen. When I do this, I expect this. And so once the software developers build something, they've written up all these test cases, they'll test it, and they'll feedback any things that aren't working, which we can raise as bugs, and the developers can work out either then or at a later stage. And then quickly on architects, architects are essentially responsible for defining the architecture of a piece of software. And what the architecture basically is how the different pieces of the software ultimately are structured and how they interact. So you may have heard of this concept called microservices, a microservices approach to software architecture, and that's basically like breaking down certain pieces of functionality into separate parts and then linking them with APIs. If you're doing that, it's important to understand like what these different services will be and how they interact. And an architect is essentially the person that's responsible for defining that, and also how the product interacts with other systems outside of its scope. I mean, in Salt as well, right now we have this role called an engineering manager, which some companies have, some don't, but ultimately you can think of them as being similar to an architect, but ultimately a bit of a broader role, and essentially they're responsible for the how are we building stuff. The product manager is responsible for the what and the why. What is the problem we're trying to solve, what's the vision we're trying to achieve, and ultimately what are the set of features that we're trying to offer and what the priority and roadmap of them should be. The engineering manager is responsible for the overall thing of like, right, this is the vision that we're going after, these are the features, etc. This is how we're going to actually build them, right? So this encompasses architecture, this encompasses like the software development team ways of working, the tech stack, all of this stuff. They're essentially responsible high level for the how are we achieving this and how are we delivering this value. All good?
All straightforward.
Cool. Alternatives to Scrum. So as I said, like Scrum is a methodology which is supposed to guide on how to implement the agile philosophy, but there are other methodologies as well which try to accomplish the same thing. A key one that you should know about is Kanban, and Kanban is like I guess you could call it a slightly less structured, not in a bad way, a more kind of flexible approach to software development, which its key kind of workflow takes place on what's called a Kanban board. So you probably would have heard about these, but you've got like to do, doing, done at like a very basic level. And that's how they work. So instead of running sprints, which are like how Scrum works, so like 2-week set blocks of time with a certain objective at the end, and then you do the next sprint and have a different objective. Like Kanban is much more flexible. You don't have those sprints like blocks of time. Just whenever developers are next available, they'll pick up the next highest priority thing in the to-do column and just like do a kind of continuous delivery. There are other approaches as well.
We are using Kanban.
Yeah.
But we started to at the end of last week, and we're using that board kind of for the dev work that's on the way.
Mm-hmm.
So I did just get a first impression of it.
Nice.
The other day. Yeah.
Cool. I'm not the best on Kanban. Like I know the basics of it, but I'm starting to use it in one of my teams now. But yeah, I think in time I could maybe do one of these on Kanban, which would be cool, but not quite yet. So maybe you could do that for me, and we could teach each other. So that's alternatives. And then state of Scrum at Salt at the moment. It's a total mix, honestly. Some teams are using Scrum and some teams just aren't at all. So some teams are using Kanban, some teams are using Scrum, some teams are using other kind of workflows that they've either learned in other places or that they've developed themselves because it just fits their team the best. And within the teams that are using Scrum, people are using it differently as well. So there's no like, I guess, like rule about how you should implement it within your team. I think flexibility is what most people are trying to aim for. So see this as inspiration for how you could do it, not how you must do it or how everyone's doing it. I think ultimately flexing to fit the team is the best way. Cool. So that's the intro to Scrum. Shall I crack on with requirement breakdown or requirement development?
Yes.
Okay. So how this section is all about how we develop requirements, because ultimately a team doesn't know what to build unless it's described for them, right? And they have very clear-cut requirements of what needs to be developed. So this is all about how to develop these requirements and communicate them to a software development team in the best way possible. And Scrum describes a way of breaking down requirements, and I've adapted it slightly. So if you want to know the perfect way of doing it or the most accurate way of doing it, have a look at the Scrum guide. But what I'll go through here is like how we've interpreted that in a way that we feel works better for us. So let me just dive into a space that we have where I've already kind of described this structure. I do need to update it a little bit. It's a little bit out of date, but it will give us a good idea. So if we go into team management and Scrum process, motion portal Scrum process, and this is all public, by the way, so feel free to dive in anytime. We go to requirement breakdown. So how we break down requirements using a slightly enhanced version of how Scrum describes it is you essentially have 3 levels of hierarchy, right? You start with epics. Now, epics are high-level thematic categories of work which need to be done. So think about it like if we're going to build a dashboard for a web application, we could have dashboard as the epic. Then within the epic, you can have a sales over time chart. a kind of product category breakdown of sales, which have coffee, sandwiches, etc. Though, and then the epic breaks down further into those different parts. So the epic is the kind of thematic category of dashboard, and then it's broken down into 4 different subcategories. And these categories are, starting with probably the most important to least important / least common. First one is user stories, right? And that's what you'll hear about in Scrum as like the key kind of thing that you want to deliver is user stories. Now, user stories are tangible features that a user actually gets value from. So these would be things like I mentioned, the sales over time chart and the product category breakdown, a pie chart, things like this. Think about like a refund functionality, send money functionality, and any kind of things like this. These user stories are broken down into subtasks, right? That's the lowest level of hierarchy. And subtasks, rather than being this kind of high level feature, which is kind of hard to figure out where do you start implementing this thing, a subtask is an activity that a developer can do that helps actually deliver this thing. The idea is that a subtask is like, an action that a developer can take on and just do. And if you do all of the subtasks underneath a user story, you will ultimately deliver the user story. So it could be like set up this database, create this API, link these two services together, write a certain piece of code, whatever it is. So that's kind of user stories. The next part of an epic is tasks. We kind of made this up, by the way. It's used across other teams, but we ultimately think the name isn't the best, so we might think about improving it soon. But anyway, tasks are like big sort of things that you need to do, which aren't tangible, usable features for a user, but ultimately support the functionality of the overall software. So think about, for example, implementing something like Mixpanel, right, which is a product analytics tool, which helps product teams analyze user behavior over time so that ultimately they can help improve the product based on this user behavior. The user doesn't know that you've got Mixpanel, right, because it's ultimately serving the team. But it does support the overall functionality of the software because it means things are much more measurable, you can understand how people use it, etc. So that would be an example of a task. Another example of a task would be doing like a security audit to make sure that the product is secure and things like this, or even doing metrics to understand CPU usage and things like this. So those are tasks, and again, they're broken down into subtasks of like specific actions a developer can do that they need to do in order to get the task done. The other two requirements that actually sit at the kind of level 2 hierarchy, so same as user stories and tasks. One is bugs, which I'm sure you're aware of, are just like problems in the software which need to be done. Ultimately, you can think about bugs in 2 ways. One are critical bugs and one are non-critical bugs. Critical bugs should be taken care of straight away. Non-critical bugs should be added to the backlog and tackled when they kind of reach the top in terms of priority. So that's bugs. And then the last one is spikes. And spikes, I don't have it in here. We need to add it. I think we have it at the bottom here. That's what it looks like, or at least how we have it in Jira. And a spike is essentially a piece of research work or proof of concept work to understand like how we're going to achieve something. So if, for example, to use the dashboard example, if we're going to build a dashboard, but like we actually don't know how we're going to do it, and we might want to use some kind of external third-party components library to like build out this chart. We're not sure that the APIs are going to give us what we want, so we can't start building it immediately because we just don't know how we're going to do it at all. So the spike would happen to do a bit of research, a bit of proof of concept work to understand like what's the best way to do this. So that's what a spike is. Yeah, and those are the kind of like the the requirements and how you break them down. Bugs, you don't break them down into subtasks. Spikes, you don't break them down into subtasks. At least we don't. So yeah, that's kind of requirement breakdown.
I haven't come across spikes before, but it makes sense.
Okay. Nice. Story points, right? So this is like generally about how we estimate the complexity of work. Because once you have got these, right, once you have a list of user stories, tasks, spikes, bugs, etc., you kind of need to know how long these things are going to take so you can plan properly. How we do it in our team and how it's generally done most commonly in Scrum is using something called story points, which are a set of numbers increasing in size, which correspond to an increase in complexity of how complex we think it will be to do this thing. Importantly, it's not an estimation of time because humans are very bad at estimating time. So we more think about complexity of work. And what we specifically do is use something called Fibonacci story points, which I think I have in here. So yeah, estimation of complexity. We use Fibonacci story points to estimate complexity of issues at the story point, task, and subtask level. These are 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. So that's a Fibonacci sequence. And we have like increasing gaps essentially as we go up to make it a little bit, it's kind of a psychological thing because ultimately once you have like a number which is the size of like a 9 or a 10, you know, who knows whether it's a 9 or a 10 or an 11, because in a percentage level, it's not that much, not that big of a difference, right? So that's why we use the Fibonacci sequence to spread out the gaps as the numbers get bigger. Typically, you shouldn't go beyond 21. Even 21 is pretty huge. If what we found is if you get up to 21 points, you should think if you can split it out any further. So maybe a user story is like a 21 pointer, be like, okay, can we actually deliver something in a, you know, can we deliver this in 2 parts, right? Because ultimately, like these requirements, especially at the user story level, you should think about it in terms of what is the smallest increment of value we can deliver to a user, right? That's how you should try and break it down, right? So if you had the opportunity of delivering like I don't know, like a pie chart, right? And it has like, this is probably a really silly example, but say it has like color coding and like labels. Maybe you could do the pie chart first, and then you can do the color coding, and then you can do the labels, right? Because even each one of those is valuable to the user, rather than doing it all together. That's generally a good practice to do. So yeah, and then some other like alternatives to using Fibonacci story points. If you don't want to use these and you think they're a bit too complex, you can use t-shirt sizes. So extra small, small, medium, large, extra large. You can also use time if you want. So 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, or something like that. There are pros and cons of each. You know, time is very good, but oftentimes developers don't like using time because it's pretty hard to kind of gauge this, and humans are pretty bad at estimating time. T-shirt sizes are good, but they're like pretty simple, pretty arbitrary. And you'll see when we get into using like team analytics, like burn down charts, you can't, because it's non-numerical, t-shirt sizes, you can't like see progression over time and you can't measure them, right? You can't say we completed this many story points or this many t-shirt sizes this sprint, because you can't like add them up. So those are some of like the pros and cons. And a good way to estimate them, and we can kind of talk about this more in like sprint like refinement and stuff like this, is through what we call poker planning. So oftentimes if you're working in a team and you think like, right guys, like how many story points is this feature, is this user story? And then like the first loudest person says, oh, it's definitely an 8, right? Unless everyone else is really like a confident group of people and are willing to challenge each other, oftentimes that will give a bias to the number 8 so that everyone else is like, oh yeah, I think it's an 8 as well. Oh yeah, I think it's an 8. So that isn't great. So what you should do is poker plan, which the basic version of doing it is putting your hands up, right? And say 3, 2, 1, 5, or 3, 2, 1, 8. And you all do it together so you don't have that bias of the first person that goes. There's a great plugin on Slack that allows you to do poker planning in a Slack group. So I'd recommend using that as well. So yeah, and then finally the upstream workflow. So how do we like go from I have this idea of a feature based on some user feedback or whatever to a developer is actually ready to start building this thing, right? And ultimately that's a case of refining it, right? Adding additional detail to the point that it's ready to develop. And that is called, oh my God.
Is it?
I think I froze for a second. I don't know what I did. You still seeing my screen?
I'm still seeing your screen.
Okay, cool. Let's just carry on. My computer froze, I think.
Oh yeah, you can see at the bottom right there.
Yeah. Cool. So upstream workflow. I think I have written something about this. Yes, here we go. Perfect. So the best way to talk about this is to talk about user stories first, and how these get developed, at least within my team. And I'll just talk to the diagram. So I'll start off with you identify it first. You identified the need for this user story. This is through doing customer research, looking at data, talking to the customer relations team, whatever it is. You figure out users aren't getting an optimal experience. They have a pain point that needs to be solved. So you will, as the seeing as we're talking about Scrum here, the product owner, as the product owner, you will write up a user story and you'll prioritize it within the backlog. The backlog is essentially a list of tickets at that level 2 of hierarchy. So user stories, tasks, bugs, spikes, which have a priority order against them. So the most highest priority ones are at the top, and the least priority ones are at the bottom, right? And ultimately, the ones at the top should also be the most refined, most ready for the developers to start working on. Ones at the bottom should be the least refined. So you can imagine as these tickets go up the backlog to reach the top, you'll add more detail to them to the point that when they reach the top and they're about to be started to be worked on, they should have all the detail necessary for developers to pick them up. So to get back to this, the product owner will write the user story and their priorities are in the backlog. The best way to write a user story is to use the user story template, which I've written here. I don't know if you can see it, which is as a user, I want to action in order that I can achieve Z, like outcome. So that's a really good way of structuring a user story to make sure that you're hitting all of these key points. So that's how we write all of our user stories. At that point, design should happen, at least in our opinion, in our team. This is what we found works best. You should start design at that point. So once the product owner has written up this user story, maybe added some notes as well, like these are some key things to bear in mind about the data we can get or what we're trying to achieve or whatever it is, key information that we want to show. the designers should start doing concept generation work of like, this is the general outcome that we want to achieve, the general problem that we're trying to solve. These are some concepts of how we could do it. The product owner shouldn't be too prescriptive of it should work like this, it should do this, etc. Ultimately, the design team, they're the creatives, they can figure out the functionality of how the thing should actually accomplish this objective that you've written out in the user story. Here I've written plenty of iterations expected. So ultimately, at this point, during the design phase, the design team will essentially design some concepts and then get feedback, and then iterate on that, start, work through it and iterate until we've got to a point that we think it works well. And that iteration will be basically getting feedback from the product owner, from actual real customers. So taking prototypes to them, Figma prototypes, and seeing, does this work? What would you change, etc. And ultimately, like, you reach a point where you're like, yeah, this is pretty good. Like, this is what we want to build. You then write what are called acceptance criteria. So the acceptance criteria talk about the behavior of this user story. So the designers will ultimately provide some designs in the form of like a Figma file, but ultimately just looking at the designs, you don't know how they should like interact, and how if you push something else pops out here, right? And that behavior is what you write about in the acceptance criteria. And you write it in a slightly different template, which is if I do action, I expect outcome. So if I click login and I have inputted the correct information, I expect to be taken to the homepage, right? And that acceptance criteria, by the way, is what the quality assurance engineer will write their test cases based off, and will ultimately like test the products using. Once the acceptance criteria is written up, you then develop, if this is necessary, the architecture of how high level this feature should work. If it's interacting with any other services, internal or external, we should like basically design the architecture at that point. If you have an architect, of course, it should be done by the architect. If you don't have an architect, it should generally be done by the developers. If they're full stack, then great, anyone can do it. If front end, back end split, then probably the back end developers will work on that. Once the architecture is defined, you should then split this level 2 hierarchy ticket, so user story, into subtasks. So the developers should look at it and be like, look, we've got the designs, we've got the acceptance criteria, we know what the behavior should be, we've got the architecture, we know how it should function with other pieces of software. We have a pretty good idea of what needs to be built. Now we need to break it up into actionable tasks that each one of us can take on and actually develop, right? So the developers work on splitting that user story up into subtasks, and once they've done that, the final thing to do is to estimate the story points, right, which we've already spoken about. So do the poker planning, and each team member votes on, okay, this overall user story should be an 8-pointer or a 5-pointer, a 13-pointer, 21, whatever. Once that's agreed, it's ready for development, right? So you've got Figma designs, you've got acceptance criteria, you know what the behavior is, you know what the architecture should be. The developers have specific actionable tasks which they can do, and you know how long it's going to take roughly according to these story points, so you know how many you can do within a certain period of time, so it can be organized properly. So yeah, that's like an upstream workflow for a user story. It's probably a bit too excessive right now to dive into the upstream workflow for like the other three. I'll kind of go through like the high level differences. Tasks, it's not necessarily the product owner that will write them up. Sometimes it is. If it's like product analytics, Mixpanel, for example, then yeah, they should probably be the one to do it. But if it's like a security review or something like that, maybe it's the backend team. If it's like metrics and logging, maybe it should be backend. It all depends on who ultimately identifies the need for it. Same with spikes, right? If someone wants to do a piece of research work, proof of concept, then they should ultimately write up the spike and work with the product owner to figure out the right priority for it in the backlog. Yeah, some of them we don't do design for, right? Typically tasks, right, don't have a front end element, right? Because it's not a usable thing for the user. So typically you'll skip that, right? You won't do design. And on bugs, it's primarily the quality assurance engineer, if you have one, which should be writing up the bugs. Otherwise, it's the person just doing the testing. Also, spikes typically don't have story points. Typically, spikes you give a time box, like for the amount of time that it will take to do it. Bugs, sometimes you don't do sometimes you don't do story points, sometimes you do. It kind of depends on the team. So this workflow is essentially what you're saying here is kind of like the full workflow for user stories, which is the most complex and most lengthy kind of upstream workflow refinement process. The others just skip steps and adapt slightly according to what the information that you need against them is. Yeah, makes sense?
Makes perfect sense. And we've covered the two now, and I think what time is it? Yeah,
it's
we're
bang on time.
Bang on time. I was gonna ask, at least since you've done this quite a lot throughout what are the biggest not to do's that you've encountered in 1 and 2?
Good question. The biggest not to do's. So I'm just moving the Zoom box around.
Or we can touch upon it next time.
Yeah, maybe next time. I mean, I haven't really thought about it too much. I would say one thing is that you'll find implementing this is a lot of people think it's quite cumbersome, right? Especially not necessarily only developers, but designers as well. Like people who are typically individual contributors, they don't like to be in too many meetings, right? Because it's taking time from their day. Like it's understandable. They need to like get on with their work, and the meetings is taking away from that. So oftentimes you get resistance to doing meetings and doing these refinement sessions and sticking to this process. And people just say, oh, why can't we just like write up something and not really give it a good description and just start developing it, right? Let's just get on with it. And I think a key thing to note is that there's a balance. It is very important to try to stick to this process and stick to a structure as much as you can, but ultimately keep it efficient, right? So what I try to typically do is say, look, it's pretty important that we try and get these things done, but like let's work together to figure out how we can do it best. So maybe less meetings is good, and these refinement sessions and this upstream workflow should all be done asynchronously or whenever you have time. So that's always a balance which needs to be struck. And what else? Make sure that requirement breakdowns is stuck to. I think that's really, really valuable. And make sure that within each kind of level 2 ticket, you're outlining exactly what you're trying to achieve there. So it's understandable for other people. If someone just writes up a random ticket, which they're like, oh, I don't really have to explain it properly because I'll probably be the one doing it, it's quite disruptive for a lot of other people, because they'll look into the backlog and be like, what the hell is this thing? I have no idea what it is. Someone's written it, and if the product owner is trying to like prioritize staff or plan for sprints and things like that, it's important for everyone, no matter their background, to be able to understand tickets, at least at a reasonably high level of what we're trying to achieve. Those are kind of the key things I can think of. But next session, I'll try and give a more concrete answer.
That was a good one. It's something that I can see. See for the time being that it is not even creeping up subtly, but it's there, where it's like there's a frustration that so much is not being done, rather a lot is being talked about. But at the same time, being at a phase of discovery for the last at least few weeks minimum.
Yeah.
People really are itching to kind of get their hands
to get going. Yeah,
But
yeah,
at the
yeah.
same
It's
time,
always the case.
you can see the struggle between the two, where it's like, let me get on with it, and then you're like, on the other end, it's like, no, we need to make sure that things are in place, at least in terms of organization.
Yeah,
So work with us. Let's see how it goes,
yeah.
or do you know what? Just be patient for it with us for this phase,
Hmm.
because once we press play, then it's your realm,
Yeah,
right? So if you kind of show that bit of either compromise or cooperation, then it'll be on both ends.
for
But
sure.
I'm getting an earful here and there, so
Yeah.
I can see that being a kind of struggle.
Yeah, it's a balance, man, and it's all about like viewing your role as the enabler of the team. That's always the mindset that I try and go for. Is look, I'm trying to help us deliver our best work as a team. I'm trying to support, you know, you folks in order to deliver your best work. How can I do that, right? That's how I like to approach it, and have that kind of flexible attitude of like, I think this is important, but if you don't, think this is the best way to achieve it, how can we do it in another way so that I'm not blocking you and you can do your best work? So I think it comes down to it like an attitude thing as well. One other point that I just wanted to mention that kind of came up to me when I was skimming through here, which is another kind of tip, is road mapping and how epics relate to roadmaps. So oftentimes people can categorize work in an epic, like a thematic category, in a very broad sense. And how can I give a good example? Like in what we're building right now in the acquiring portal, like transaction history, right? And within that, it can have a number of different user stories. But ultimately, some of the user stories can be super high priority, super important, and some can be like not important at all and super in the future. And if you want to do it that way, that is fine. The downside of that is that you can't use epics within a roadmap, right? Because if you think about it, you can't be like, well, this quarter we're going to accomplish epic A, and next quarter we're going to accomplish epic B, because you can have really high priority tickets in epic A and epic B, and low priority tickets in epic A and epic B. So really you should be doing the highest priority ones across both first, and then the lowest priority ones across both first. So the epic way of looking at things on a road mapping basis, looking at it like sequentially, this epic, then that epic, doesn't work. And for a long time, I thought, oh yeah, so epics are useless. Like we shouldn't even look at them and even attempt to use them for roadmaps. What I've begun to do is to say, let's think about epics in terms of a deliverable chunk of work which has a theme to it as well. So and V1s and V2s can be a really good way of achieving this. So you can give an epic a title which is like transaction history V1, right? So it's the user stories within transaction history which are the highest priority, right? And then you can have a transaction history V2 and a transaction history V3, or like you can call it an MVP and these kind of things. But that's a nice way to look at it, which gives it that thematic category, but also allows you to roadmap it and use epics as a road mapping tool, which can be really helpful when you're looking at things at a high level, talking to stakeholders and stuff like this.
I think that I've in awe. So thank you, Ed. Honestly, it's a bit poor from you that you don't have any slides, but we'll
Yeah, I
make
know,
do.
mate. Yeah, you can give me some poor feedback if you like, and tell my boss. But
Honestly,
yeah,
thank you for taking like an hour out of your day.
no worries, man. Pleasure.
Not many people would do that, so I really do appreciate it.
No worries at all, man. Anytime. And I look forward to our next one. I think it'll be
Yes,
fun. We can delve into some
please,
more detail.
but please